Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guests today, Kimberly Maize and Savannah Woodward. Kimberly and Savannah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Kimberly Maize and Savannah Woodward are a mother-daughter powerhouse duo who co-founded One Planet Healing, a grassroots trauma survivor and woman-owned organization focused on minimizing the re-traumatization of people impacted by trauma. Their focus is on the human rights and social justice issues created by institutional betrayal, changing the current paradigm of assisting people in their recovery and providing opportunities for people to learn in-depth perspectives of trauma resolution. Kimberly utilized her decades of introspection during her recovery from dissociative identity disorder, working with hundreds of people impacted by trauma and implementing research and insights from wisdom keepers worldwide in developing the life-saving trauma response system model. Savannah is a second-generation trauma specialist and a moving the human spirit certified trauma-informed coach. Savannah has a decade of experience and vast knowledge in working with people impacted by trauma and is most passionate about helping utilizing her experiences of recovery when working with families and healing intergenerational or transgenerational trauma. Oh, a mouthful there. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So, all right, before we go in here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you both are currently.
We're both from Southern California originally. I moved to Iowa in the early 90s to provide a safer and some distance from my family of origin and to get her to a safer place to be than where our hometown is pretty dangerous. And there was a university in the town that we moved to. And so that's where we ended up. Now we're in Wisconsin after, a decade or so of going different places. We've landed here in the Midwest.
Okay. So, Savannah, let me ask you, how did this interest in what you're doing start for you?
Well, to be honest, I feel like I was kind of born into it, born into a really traumatizing environment. And eventually, as I got older, being surrounded by social workers and, my mom received a diagnosis when I was 13, a trauma-informed diagnosis that really changed our lives. And I think that my true wake-up call as to why trauma-informed care and trauma-specific education is so important is when I had my own children and I really recognized how my childhood trauma affected how I parented and how I showed up for them. And so that's what really led to me diving deep, is to not only improve my own experience as a parent, but also help other parents, not struggle so much.
So Kimberly, share with our listeners who might not have listened in on our first episode, but give us a thumbnail sketch of your experience. What led you to this field?
Well, like Savannah said, I was definitely born into it. I have to be honest, I didn't have the capacity at the time to make any grounded, insightful decisions about what I wanted to do with my life. I honestly went to school because school was very easy for me. I could basically do nothing and get A's and fall apart inside, which is what I was doing. I ended up going into social work because I wanted to be able to continue going to school and get financial aid, because I was literally I was extremely dissociative and fragmented, and I didn't get I was in school from the early 90s. And then I ended up dropping out of graduate school, but went back later after I had some recovery. So that was in 1999. I didn't get my what we consider a trauma-informed, as much as you could at the time, diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder until 2003. So,
and at what age were you at that point?
I was very fragmented and dissociating.
At what age were you at that point?
33.
Okay, so how were you managing prior to that, during that time?
Not very well. as you know, her childhood can contest. Like I said, I was in and out of the psychiatric hospital, suicidal ideation attempts, self-harm, 30, 40 hospitalizations. I was on Social Security disability. And I honestly, some people say that they don't remember their childhood. I honestly don't remember probably 85% of my entire life, because that's the severity of my dissociation. Honestly, I had enough intellect, which is a privilege. I think, I had enough intellect to be able to succeed, like a parent competency, like Marshall and Hen said. I looked different than I was because I was able to succeed in school while still being DID, because I could front, I could show up, and I was able to do very well. And I got financial aid back then. Single mothers got a lot of money. And so I lived in government housing, and I didn't make it very well. By the time I had my diagnosis, I had completely stopped functioning. I was not working, was not going to school. I was, probably one of the closest times to ending my life, when my psychiatrist got trauma informed. He went and trained with Dr. Colin Ross at Timberlawn in Texas. And getting DID diagnoses then is not like now, where it seems to be much more prevalent of a diagnosis. Then you didn't get that diagnosis. And so for him, and he had been my psychiatrist for 10 years, so he knew me. And, he actually apologized to me later and said, "I'm sorry I misdiagnosed you with all those diagnoses. I just didn't know. I wasn't confident enough in my ability to diagnose trauma to give you the diagnosis that I felt you deserved." But now it's so blaringly obvious. And that diagnosis literally changed our lives and saved my life, because I finally didn't see myself as a mentally ill person anymore. I was like, oh, now I see what you're telling me. And that made much more sense. That's the only diagnosis I ever resonated with. And I had 25 different diagnoses during my years in the mental health system.
So
which is why we're here.
Yeah. First of all, I appreciate both of you coming on here and sharing this. This is, I would imagine, not very easy to share, to talk about all this stuff, talk about your life like this. I think it takes a lot of courage, and I really appreciate and commend you for the work you're doing. And I want to get into the great work you're doing. But I also want to set the stage here. So Kimberly, you said you grew up in a, I guess chaotic would be an understated statement, chaotic life, traumatizing life, childhood.
An understatement, yes.
Yeah.
The severity of my trauma.
Okay.
It's beyond. Yeah, it's extreme.
Now, Savannah, so was it both of you? Do you have siblings, Savannah?
I'm the only child.
Just me and her.
Okay.
So mom.
So your mother raised you. To what degree were you aware of what was going on? How did you interpret what was going on?
I think that when I was really young, it was so normalized that it was just kind of what it was. And it was just what I dealt with daily. And I was just kind of in that childlike perspective of my mom, of my situation. It wasn't until, maybe 10, 11, 12, when I started realizing that I was different than other people, that, my mom was different, my home was different. And, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I truly understood the severity of my trauma until my mid to late 20s, when I really was able to slow down, do my own work, process. There was a little bit more space in my life to be able to look inward and to work on myself. I started to do more yoga and meditation, doing more introspection, and I really became hyper aware of how my trauma impacted my behavior. And again, like I said, when my children were born, I was 25 and 26 when my two sons were born. And, I know a lot of parents out there kind of feel this way too, that they are a direct reflection of who you are and what you've been through, your beliefs, your values, your habits. And it was like having two little mirrors just running around. And then once I lost my first husband in 2019, everything changed. I recognized how I had recreated my role, my childhood role of caregiver, onto my husband, how that affected me, my relationship with my mom, my relationship with my kids. And that's really when I was like, trauma is now everything to me. I understand my life and most of the people around me. And that's when things really changed. So the last 4 years, I've just taken a deep dive.
Well, and her childhood was, is my mom going to take her life? Is my mom's going to the hospital again. My mom, her entire life revolved around me and getting my needs met. She was very much secondary. And I was so motivated by trauma. Sometimes when people's trauma is so big, they don't see anyone else, including their children, which is why we're here again, is to help. We want to minimize that and help people to recognize that all trauma-motivated behaviors are understandable reactions to their experiences. And it's okay to not be ashamed that your parenting is affecting your children. I mean, this is what our podcast is about. A New Generation podcast is us telling about how we had to take radical responsibility to heal the transgenerational, intergenerational trauma. And that's a hard look at my impact on her as a parent and her on her children and my generational trauma. And so her role as my caretaker was so recreated in her relationships. I think it wasn't until, like she said, her first husband took his life that she really realized, wait a minute, this role was created by my mom.
Absolutely.
So was there a point, Savannah, where you took off, went to live, quote unquote, live your life? At what point was that? When did you guys kind of separate?
Not very well. We were very, very enmeshed.
Yeah, so it's kind of, been touch and go for many years. There's been times throughout my life where I've tried to distance, try to do my own work, and then come with the intention of coming back to my family system more well-adjusted. And I was continually being re-traumatized by different parts of my life that it was nearly impossible to be able to do that work. I think that I first tried to do that when I was 16 or 17. I moved out of my mom's house into my grandparents' house, and then I moved into my own apartment before I was 18. And there were a few years there where I was trying to sober up from substances. I was trying to find my autonomy. And I feel like I succeeded to do so. It kind of was in layers over the years. And so I think that was the first layer in me saying, okay, I'm allowed to kind of step away from my mom. My mom had started to prove to me that she was well enough. And this was obvious. I mean, maybe not obvious, but obvious to me now, very subconscious, that I was trying to pull away. And there have been many times throughout my life where we've taken space, we've gone months at a time. But one of the most impactful boundaries that I've asserted in my life was what we call the divide. We talk about it on our podcast quite a bit. And it was a 18-month no contact where my mom and I had no contact for 18 months. And my sole intention was to try to find autonomy after decades of enmeshment.
You named it the divide?
Yes.
Later,
Okay.
after we came back, because we both have talked about it and agreed at the time, the extent of the trauma that caused the incidents that led up to the divide were so extreme that both of us thought we'd never talk to each other again. I literally thought I'd never talk to my daughter or see my grandson again. Yeah.
So, okay, let's just, I want to pause here for a moment to thank our sponsors. We're talking with Kimberly Maize and Savannah Woodward of One Planet Healing. We'll be back in a couple seconds. Hang on here, folks. All right. So what brought you back? How did that event happen?
Well, there was something going on in my personal life that led to us having to have conversations just for legal reasons. I had to ask her a couple questions to be able to get through a lawsuit that I've been enduring. And that was the first practical reason as to why we reconnected. I had already been considering wanting to reconnect because we had some communication the last couple of months of our no contact around our perspective, what we thought had happened. It was a first attempt at repair. And because that had been going successful, we were able to communicate in a way that we hadn't before. Although it was via email, there was definitely a shift in the relationship dynamic and communication that was very clear to me. And so I was already considering reconnecting. And then this very terrible situation kind of brought us back together, but it was meant to be, I feel. And so after we were able to communicate about something that was so difficult, I was kind of like, well, okay, we got through that. Maybe we could talk about other difficult things. And that was just kind of the door opening to many, many conversations on our perspective on why it had been the way that it had been, what we needed to do, taking being radically self-aware, taking radical self-responsibility of me as a daughter. This is how I contributed. You as a mom, this is how you contributed. We were able to really hold space for one another, validate one another, and really got through some of those really difficult conversations that we had been avoiding for decades. And it's
hang on, pause a second here.
Sure.
So I don't want to skip over that because that in and of itself is incredible. I mean, that you have the ability, the wherewithal, the awareness to, look at the roles each of you, quote unquote, played in this. I'm curious, Kimberly. I mean, this is, I just can't imagine what you've gone through. And how are you doing now?
Fantastic.
That's amazing.
Ever been. Yeah, I mean, it's I actually sometimes say to myself, wow, I can't believe who you are now. I mean, living as a person who had such severe complex trauma, what I've been through, having that diagnosis, fully integrating that diagnosis, which probably took about 2 decades. The truth of the matter is that I had to look at what childhood needs I was trying to get met through my daughter that didn't belong to her. And that was a physical feeling I could feel inside. And because I got none of my needs met from my mom or family of origin, I overly enmeshed and tried to overly attach with her, and it was suffocating her. And it was starting to come out, on the grandkids. And even though the divide was the most painful thing I ever had been through, because I thought I was going to lose the only family I had, it had to happen because I had to become an individual person by myself that didn't have these wounded attachment issues with my daughter. And because I did that, I I became a whole individualized person that can meet my own needs.
What has allowed you or helped you to gain this type of awareness?
The trauma response syndrome model, the model that I created to help with trauma resolution.
So your own model, your own development of this model, how did you develop that? I mean, what helped you, pardon me, to, at some point, you've got to stand back, be able to stand back and look at what has gone on. What enabled you to do that initially?
So what I'm able to do that initially is because I became extremely hyper-focused on trauma and learning about trauma. So I started reading all of Bessel van der Kolk's research in the early 2000s and, reading about childhood developmental disorder, which is what he's trying to put in the DSM. And that research wasn't published yet. I took a really deep dive into, Dr. Colin Ross's work, Alice Miller, Patrick Carnes with sex addiction, those kinds of things. I went inpatient on a trauma unit for 30 days that doesn't exist anymore because, of course, they lose funding. But that really opened my eyes and helped me to understand. I literally although I didn't really remember, once it was put in a trauma paradigm, what was going on with me, I did begin to, I stepped back and started to witness, why was I doing what I was doing? Because it took probably about 3 years of very, very intense trauma therapy before I was even integrated enough to be able to function. So, it took 5 years before I was okay enough to be able to take a step back, take radical responsibility, be able to, the biggest thing was to watch myself and think, why was I doing what I was doing? And it came back down to trauma-based needs and understanding the concepts that have been created into this model when they were really tiny, and them growing and taking, concepts from theories and then applying trauma to them and making it bigger because, a lot of people don't understand the intricacies of trauma, especially trauma motivated behaviors. And that's what I started to recognize and witness. But of course, the number one thing is I stopped engaging in the trauma motivated behaviors. I stopped engaging with men and no drugs and alcohol. I stopped re-traumatizing myself every day with my own behaviors. That's the key, probably.
How did One Planet Healing start? How did you folks come about? Let's do this.
Probably it started with the extreme, we are not anti-psychiatry. We are pro-informed consent, pro-informed, what I call pro-informed diagnosing, is that we need to stop the medicalizing and pathologizing of human suffering. That's the main thing, is that when you spend 25 years in a mental health system where you're misdiagnosed and wrongly medicated, and it nearly took my life, and that's still happening, that's what needs to stop. I was not bipolar. I had 4 different personality disorder diagnoses. None of them were correct. I had, like I said, I had psychosis. Every single thing that I experienced was from trauma, and nobody understood it. And so then they wrongly medicated me. I was on 12 or 14 psychiatric medications at one time. That has to stop. We need to stop. There's no reason for that.
So I want to get to Savannah, did you sit down and say, let's start this program, this project? How did that come about?
I think, I don't know if it was that concrete, but after talking about our life story, at first your reaction to our story of like, wow, I can't believe that this is happening. We kind of had that same aha that once I became an adult, we sat down and really started talking about the stories we had experienced, what we had been through, what we were seeing. We were assisting people in recovery at the time, hearing their stories. But, I think what really pushed me over the edge was losing my first husband to malpractice and really seeing the same experience that I had had as a child. I witnessed all of this as a child, but because I had that childlike perspective, of course, I didn't totally understand the impact. But then once I saw it play out, at almost 30 years old and really recognized, wow, this impacted my husband's family, my children, to really just see it all play out as an adult and feel powerless to that, I really tapped into the millions of people out there that feel powerless to the system. And they don't have the resources or the wherewithal to be able to advocate for themselves, stand up for themselves. And I don't know how else to say it. Something inside of me came alive. I was born when that happened, where I was like, this is my purpose. Yeah. That's why this happened to me. I got to tell everyone I know that there's a different way. If we could look at it in a more trauma-informed way of how trauma impacts our body, our nervous system, our thinking, our belief systems,
our behaviors,
and really have the opportunity to be trained in that, I honestly feel that thousands of people and thousands of lives would be saved and suicides would be prevented.
So how did One Planet Healing, how did you start that? What did you say, Mom, we got to do this? Or Kimberly, did you say, Savannah, we got to do this?
It's been like percolating for the last decade, probably, I was very psych injured from medication withdrawal. And so I was very sick for a long time. And I thought, well, I'm never talking about trauma again because I was, a lot had happened. But then, as our life experience started to grow together and I started working with people again, and then, because really the concept of One Planet Healing started in 2014. And it just has now that we've gone through what we needed to go through, because we were too enmeshed to be able to actually make anything happen as far as an organization. And so it had to be this divide. For now, we've come back together. Now we live 20 minutes from each other. And now is when we're like, we know exactly what our message is and what needs to happen and how and why. And so now we're finally in the last year fully bringing One Planet Healing to the forefront after about a decade.
And we definitely did have a conversation after we lost Curtis of this cannot happen again. I think that was the final straw. Once we lost him, we were like, there's no more messing around. It doesn't matter if we have a bad day or not. We're pushing through. We got to get this message out. And as soon as we started talking about it, the response that we have from people that we work with, people who listen to our podcast, it's infectious. Mm-hmm. And now we don't have a choice. We have to do this thing. It's like part of our purpose.
Interject here. Just to be clear, what happened with your past husband was he fell victim to the system in a sense?
Yes.
And took his own life?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the goal or the mission of One Planet Healing?
To minimize the re-traumatization of those impacted by trauma.
And we do that by providing alternative perspectives of working with people other than the medical and diagnostic approach. Viewing people so our perspective is that we're not saying there's no such thing as mental illness. We'd never say that. I've spent way too much time working in the mental health system to say that. But people who have histories of complex trauma have different experiences, and we need to be seen as 100% having understandable reactions to what and people need to get educated on trauma so they can recognize all of this is trauma. I call it trauma response syndrome. All these diagnoses people are getting, they're not correct.
Right.
What the disconnect is currently is, okay, I see that you have this horrible complex trauma and you're bipolar. That's the disconnect. No, they're not bipolar. These are all trauma responses. And so we want to educate people. One of our goals is to minimize the power differentiation that inherently happens in healing spaces. So we really change our language to decrease that, to put the power back in the hands of the people who are being served, essentially. So, we are educators. We're educating people on trauma. We are not, that's what we do. And we want to train other people to be able to do that so that the people who need the help can take that information and utilize it in their own lives. And so our mission is to train as many people as we can in this perspective to help more people. Because
so are you training anyone? Educators, therapists, coaches, survivors. So anyone can come to your site and get the education. And how are these educational materials delivered? Is everything online?
Yes, everything will be online. Right now, there will be Teachable. There's stuff on Teachable, but we would like to be able to have opportunities to train in person as much as possible, because that's much more dynamic. But we hold courses that we trainings, webinars, those kinds of things, so that people can see online to maybe eventually come to us to train in person.
Okay.
Our main, what we would like the most is that people who have lived experience, who are called to assist others and are doing their inner work. That's the ideal trauma specialist, in my perspective. So we call therapists, counselors, those kinds of things. We call those people, anyone who assists in the recovery of others would benefit from training in the trauma response syndrome model under One Planet Healing. So we want to change that language to move away from anything that's treatment oriented, because people who are drawn to us, they want a different language. They want a different paradigm. They want a different perspective. And that's what we offer.
I mean, for me, what's very powerful about what you both are doing is your relationship, naturally, and your ability to speak from different positions in that relationship. That's very unique and very powerful. And the fact that, you had this divide and what caused that, and your ability to come back and utilize a different lens through which to look at your relationship, and then to move beyond that or forward and start what you're doing is so friggin' amazing. And it's really inspiring. It really is. I talk to a lot of people, and I haven't definitely not have had people on like yourselves who are doing this.
We're
very proud of ourselves. Yeah.
We're very proud of ourselves, and I'm telling you, it's
a lot of hard work.
It's a lot of hard work to be able to take radical responsibility as a parent and say, it wasn't okay how you were raised. It wasn't okay, your role. It wasn't okay how I acted. None of those things were okay. You are the most important. I am the parent. You are the child. And I need to be able to relate to you in that way. And I do it without 1000% no shame. That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not ashamed of it because trauma motivated my behaviors. Now I was for a very long time, but that's another one of our main goals, and what we're very passionate about is that we work with a lot of families where I work with the parent or the parents, and she works with the child, mostly adolescents, and we help them, heal their transgenerational trauma, because everybody gets heard and validated, and then they can come together and we can mediate, and it's very powerful. That's because when families heal, society heals.
Yeah. Well, look, I want to wind down here. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Both of our emails are on the website, which is Kimberly Maize, Maize, KimberlyMaize.com.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of everything that you could possibly want to know is there.
Okay. And your podcast is a New Generation podcast. We'll have that linked up.
New Generation. This is our logo, if anyone's looking.
Okay.
And it's on Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And we're all over social media if you're interested in following along.
Okay. We'll have those linked up. Look, you two, love to have you back. You are definitely a dynamic power duo. It's amazing. I mean, come on, you're so friggin' inspiring.
Thank you, guys.
That means a lot coming from you, guys. We really appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. But it's what you're doing is amazing. So look, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a good
Bye-bye.